All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Preschool Podcast webinar edition. Today, we are so happy to welcome Tiffany Torres of the Preschool Marketing Group, who is here today to give us some tips and tricks about preschool marketing and why marketing for your child care center and thinking about a marketing mindset or even a small business mindset can be really useful to you as a preschool director, administrator, teacher, or even if you're a parent of a child at a center and you're thinking about different ways that you can offer advice or tips to your child care center. Hopefully you get some ideas today that you can use in the future. So our guest today joining us live is Tiffany, and maybe you want to just give us a quick introduction of who you are and your work, and then we'll jump into some questions.
My name is Tiffany Torres. I am the Chief Creator of Opportunities with the Preschool Marketing Group, and basically we help schools increase enrollment through smart marketing.
That's wonderful. Now, who, if we had to give a bit of a persona for the type of audience that you work with, the type of child care centers or directors that you're working with, do you want to give us a bit of an idea of who it is that you work with, some of your prime clients maybe?
Sure. So we work with schools pretty much of all sizes and that serve all demographics. Our goal is really to provide valuable marketing to schools that serve everyone. So basically we look at, directors that are sometimes owners or owners that have a director that are so busy fulfilling their mission of teaching the minds of tomorrow that maybe they don't have the time to learn a new skill like marketing, which can take a lot of time out of a month. So we really want them. Part of the reason that we got into schools and early childhood education is because we had our first son and we understood how important this stage of education is to a child and how it can lay the foundation for the rest of their lives when it comes to learning. So we wanted to empower teachers to be able to find families that were a great fit for their centers. So we work with schools across the board, everything from Reggio and academic-based and Montessori and faith-based, just to make sure that they are conveying their value to families.
And if you're thinking about starting to convey your values, how can we communicate who we are as a child care center? What stage in that work would it be appropriate to contact you? In sort of a brainstorming stage, or maybe when you're ready to carry out a campaign? When do people traditionally call you?
It really varies. We help schools throughout the variety of steps that it takes, including retention. So we look at a couple of different phases as key milestones. There's the amount of inquiries they're getting per month, the amount of tours they're bringing in per month, how many of those tours are becoming enrollments, and how happy the families were during the tours. And then there's the important stage of retention, which is making sure that once the families are in there, you're expressing as a school how happy the kids are. And that can be a really challenging point for some schools because kids are not, especially kids of this age, they don't come home and just talk about their day and all of the things that they did and stuff like that. Some of our schools serve kids that are pre-verbal. They're not, going to come home and say, here was our curriculum for today. So while these schools are making sure that they're, a lot of my schools are very protective over the educational process, and they really want to make sure that they're focusing on the kids. And there's that balance between focusing on the kids and fulfilling that mission and that goal, and making sure that they're communicating that to families, even prospective families.
It's so interesting because I think what I really value about what you're saying is the importance of early stage learning, the formative years of 0 to 5, and how it sometimes can be hard to communicate that to parents and get parents on how do we know we need to put our children into childcare, but sometimes our motivations for seeking out childcare are because we've got to go to work. And sometimes they are for socialization, for special needs support, for a whole host of reasons why. And so to start to think about the importance and the value that a center brings from a parent view is really interesting. And I love that you bring in your experience as a parent into that work. So one of the things that so you were a previous guest on our preschool podcast, and in that podcast, which we'll play some of the clips at the end of this Q&A for our listeners who maybe hadn't heard it before, you emphasized the importance of using available tools to build relationships. Could you emphasize a bit on that? Maybe tell us a bit about what you mean, some examples that our viewers could use.
Sure. So, I mean, marketing is really about building relationships through, across that entire experience with the school. So, going through and looking at that, what we call ITER, that inquiries, tours, enrollment, and retention, we're really looking at how can we start to build and nurture that relationship early on. So during the inquiry process, a lot of families are not going to be very familiar with you. Maybe they just Googled preschool near me and they found this particular set of schools. We see that families will research somewhere between 2 to 5 options before making those first phone calls. So, I mean, really the first step is what they're being met with when they first research you, be that through Google or word of mouth or anything along those lines. And making sure that that communication from your website, from social media is warm and friendly and really represents what the school is giving to the children. After that comes the touring step, hopefully. And throughout the tour, it's just a matter of making sure that you continue to build on that relationship. Continue to speak to what the family is looking for in particular, and just ask those questions that make them feel that that they are the main focus for your school. After that is the enrollment and making sure that that tour to enrollment relationship goes well. Sometimes families are looking at ECE options super early on. Maybe they're pregnant and they're looking for some kind of educational but nurturing environment for their little ones. So making sure that you're continuing to nurture that and email them and say, hey, we thought this might be useful given the stage that you're at. And then through retention and making sure that the families are aware of all of the hard work that goes on throughout the day at your school. It doesn't, a lot of my schools will focus on what's necessary and say, well, we've told them how many, wet diapers, how many bottles and things like that. And that's super important, but the emotional side has to be there too. And here's what your child did. And, all of these different elements that can come into that element of communication and relationship building.
So important. We've seen some recent studies over the summer on social emotional learning and the importance of parent communication and social emotional learning. That I read a recent study that said 2 of the key reasons, or 2 of the main ways to deploy social emotional curriculum is parent communication and professional development of educators. And I think those 2 pieces are so closely connected to how we communicate with our families and the relationships that we have. Maybe let's talk about social emotional learning for a few minutes. It can be a complex topic. I think from educators, we understand and see the value of children's socialization, the cognitive, social, academic, different types of learning and pedagogy. But what's your advice for how centers can communicate the importance without maybe getting too term heavy, too academic, where parents don't, it's important, but it's hard to get on board when these terms can be so maybe industry specific?
That is a huge issue from a lot of my schools. So, you have, I come from a marketing and technical background as opposed to my educators, and a lot of directors and even owners come from a very heavy educational background. So what we wind up with is, we talk about sensory play and manipulatives and social emotional learning and these big kind of words. And as a first-time mom, even understanding what sensory play is, when you throw those words out there, it's jargon. And sometimes it can make you feel a little dumb if you don't know what these words mean. Like, where did I miss that in the birthing class, So it's so important to make sure, I coach all of my schools. Content's really big. Content is how you're communicating with your families a lot of times before they make that connection with you. So my rule with communication as far as that goes is when you're talking, when you're writing, try to aim for a pop sci like Discovery Channel or TLC documentary on early learning. And if what you're saying sounds more like it's better for an audience for ECE students, then it's probably a little bit too high up. For parents, we want to know what the benefit of that kind of learning is. And we also want to understand, in the grand scheme of what's important to my child, we want to understand where that fits in. So a lot of times you have, like, let's say first-time moms are my favorite, because first-time moms tend to be a little bit more, I don't want to use the word neurotic, but we can tend to be a little bit more nervous. Yes. And, so much so that, I tell my schools I can relate to that mom, because I am that mom, sending my son to school with his own soap to use and stuff like that, and his own hand sanitizer. So I really think when we're talking, when I first started looking at EC opportunities for my son, it was what sensory play. So instead of just saying sensory play, mention what it is and how it affects the brain development, things like language immersion, all of these different things where these concepts are super important to kids, but we don't want to alienate parents and caregivers by making them seem like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. So keep that language a little bit lower. Again, we're looking for something that's consumable by most people.
Yes, such great advice. That often I think when we get in the weeds a bit in the sector. I mean, us at Hi Mama here, I'm a teacher in the evenings, but during the day we live and breathe an app and communication. And so even in such the terms like app and software and messaging and chat, we take for granted that people know what we're talking about. And often there's a bit of a gut check that happens. I really like this idea of like, who exactly, like thinking of your audience, who exactly are you talking to? And are we talking to our early adopters and our core techies, or are we talking to people who are interested in communicating with their centers? And if that's the case, then we can come down a level in the language.
And one of the things that's really good for that is actually stories. So working with, let's say, a project-based school, where that's their paradigm for education, you can say project-based, and most parents, especially first-time parents, are not going to understand what that means. So take them through a story. We remember stories so much better than we remember like facts and statistics and, just information. So what we did with this one school was an amazing school, to go through how a specific subject could be explored in a project way. So learning about trees, you can make instruments out of, tree logs, and you can use different parts of trees like pine cones and acorns to use dramatic play in food preparation and things like that. And just explaining, you don't have to be the same way that my schools don't want to learn marketing. Parents don't necessarily want to study early childhood education. Right? They want to do what they're doing, which is being a caregiver, being nurturing, and still, supplying their child with that rich experience. So use stories, even when you're describing sensory play, this is why it's good, and here's an example of it. And that really helps to illustrate the point of these different elements.
I can see that even in a very practical example at my daughter's daycare, childcare center. There's always this consistent message around labeling clothes. Label clothes, label clothes, label clothes, please label clothes. If you don't label the clothes, you could lose the pieces. And being on the board of directors, I see how much work the staff are going into constantly getting everybody dressed, especially we're in Toronto, Canada, and winter, and gloves and hats. And there's just pieces to everything. And it's so interesting to think about how that whole conversation, which can sometimes be viewed as a bit naggy, right? Label, label, label. There's a masking tape outside the door when we drop them off, make sure to label, to transform that into a story and describe what getting ready to go outside for playtime looks like, and what it looks like when there are 3 gloves and 4 hands, and when we have inside shoes but no outside shoes, but it's snowing, and why the labeling is so important to make everybody's day go a lot easier and get everybody outside to have some fun. It transforms that whole conversation. I think it's so interesting.
And really explaining it in terms of a benefit to the child. So if the staff, if that note that went home, and again, there's so many different parts to marketing. Every piece of communication that you have with a family is marketing because it's continuing to build that relationship. So if the note that went home was something along the lines of, hey, we love spending as much time outside as possible, and when this goes smoothly, the kids get to enjoy themselves more. And then that's not phrased in terms of help the teacher, that's framed in terms of help your child, and it helps work towards that family's agenda.
I think that's such practical, great advice for our educators who are just trying to get through the day, right? And so we get very focused on the outcome and thinking about the process. So it's such a maybe a faster way even to the outcome you're trying to achieve. So one thing that I noted in the podcast, but I'd love to bring it up here since we're having a chat. What would you say to the parents who say, yes, this is all well and good, but I just prefer to have a quick conversation with my childcare director. I don't want all this digital communication. I get enough notifications on my phone. How can childcare directors manage that feedback?
I think, again, putting it in terms of what the family is looking for. There needs to be, in PCT, the parent communication technology, doesn't replace that in-person element. It really is a great supplement for it. And then eventually it will, as we see it become more prevalent, it will come to a point where that could be a primary source of information. Because of the audiences that my schools are starting to deal more and more with, the millennials, the young Gen Xers, we are more accustomed to having that communication through digital, right? So there is that level of familiarity that's increasing. Really, from what I've seen, most of the times those families, once they're pacified in a way, once they understand there is a real person that's filling out this information on the other side, they will start to kind of calm down. We do see a lot of this type of behavior from specifically first-time moms, which again, they're beneficial to a center because they tend to have more than one children depending on where you live. And if you can impress them with the first child, you'll usually get the second and third child. And from a business perspective, that really elongates that lifetime value of the family. From a missions-based perspective, that means that you have 2 to 3 children that you can really, make a difference in this world with. So we grit and bear it sometimes with the first-time moms and first-time parents that are, they want to call every day just to see how they're doing, but that does tend to calm down.
So that's great advice. You've got lots of really great resources, even in just some of your experience and storytelling here. How can people work with you? And maybe if they can't work with you directly, how can they get some access to some of your great knowledge?
So we do have a blog on our website, preschool-marketing.com, and we also love talking to preschools. So we would encourage anybody who's curious about what we do to go ahead and give us a call. You can go to our website and get all of our contact information. And like I said, really our goal is to help you in your mission to help kids.
Mm-hmm. It's the thing about marketing, I mean, my role at Hi Mama here is the marketing manager, so I think about marketing all day. And one of the things that sometimes we hear about with feedback is that marketing feels like an extra step that we don't have time for in childcare centers, right? Like we are working on meals and check-in and attendance and curriculum and managing staff, and marketing is a nice to have. So I think it's important, and I really value your input on all of the benefits beyond marketing, not just as an enrollment tool, as important as that is, but marketing as a communication platform to really reach and maintain a relationship with parents.
It really is. And, one thing I do want to note is that communication with parents, especially through these PCTs, the parent communication technologies, it's a great way to prevent your families from leaving to a competition. It's a great tool. It's that extra that you can show at the end of a tour that says, and you'll see all of this information. And we're also seeing it as a way that our schools that are competing against different programs that different locations have in the US now, such as Universal Pre-K in New York City, are able to differentiate themselves and kind of show that extra level that they're doing. I think a lot of schools focus on PCTs when they're at daycare or when the children are very young or pre-verbal. But we're seeing more of a benefit in our older grades, in our 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old programs, because you're still dealing with a 5-year-old's mentality of, I just came home from school, I don't really want to talk about it, you know, and you don't want to push them to do that psychologically because then they feel the pressure. But making sure that, you know, songs that are being sung and activities that are coming up, these are still hugely important. And I don't want schools that have older programs, you know, some of my schools just have a 3, 4, 5-year-old program. They think that this is more for just younger children, and it's a useful tool for the whole spectrum.
That's such great advice. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking is, especially as you get into older programs, is potentially emergency contacts as well. So, you know, in the case of needing to shut down, maybe there's a weather, power outage, snow day, or a more serious emergency that comes up. Do we consider how quickly we can get a hold of parents, how they can communicate in a two-way forum where they could potentially message back, ask questions, versus getting on the phone if that's not possible? Is that something that you talk to about centers in sort of like a larger emergency planning context? Is that something that ever comes up?
We do, especially with our schools in Texas and Florida recently.
Right.
That was a huge, you know, that was a work through the weekend, make sure that we're on call for any questions that come up. Because even in the aftermath of those, there was, when is the center going to reopen? You know, how are we handling this? What is the outcome of this going to be? What's the state of the center? Is it underwater? So yeah, that's a really important element too. And I do have some schools that rely on one-way text messaging services. And we find those being very limited as far as their capabilities go, because that's not something where the parents can often write back with a question. It's not a direct line of communication, it's a broadcast. So then the question is, okay, then what happens next and all of this stuff. And it's much easier to communicate on a platform that has that two-way communication.
That's great. Of course, warms our heart at Hi Mama, because we're always talking about one-way versus two-way and static messages, you know, a Facebook page or Twitter. Is important to do center-wide one-way announcements, but when we start to talk about parent involvement, even as like, you know, we need to close the school today, please come pick up your children, being available to answer questions and not being stuck to the phone, which, you know, can't get to as many people as possible, is really important consideration.
It's not just that, it's that we've seen families actually, because of the lack of communication and because of the lack of sometimes cell service in certain areas and things like that, what will start to happen is that the families that know each other will form this own like text group. And then we get telephone with partial information. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, wait, but I heard from this person that it was doing this. And then it's not coming from the leadership of the school, which can also be very confusing as a family.
It's such an important point. I've seen that in my own life with different moms when where things have been going on at school, or even I use the example of power outages. We had some high winds here in Toronto, and our phone lines at school went down, and it was an immediate, you know, if I can't get a hold of the school, I'll text the mothers I know to find out if everything's okay, to just see what's going on.
So, and then again, bringing that back to marketing, that introduces what we call friction across the relationship. And the more that friction builds up, the more that they'll consider another program, another school, maybe a free school, because they're not seeing that value. They really want to feel, for the most part, that this is an extension of their family. And as quickly as, they could get a family member on the phone or communicate with them, they want to see that kind of happen with their school.
Great point. Well, we've taken more of your time than we intended to for this, for the Q&A part of this, but I think it's really valuable. It's nice to have a conversation and hear about different areas of your work. For our listeners, if you want to ask a live chat question, we are live at this moment, so you absolutely can put that in the right-hand side of the chat. If not, you can always reach out directly to Tiffany to ask any questions, and I would encourage you to visit her website, or you can always tweet Hi Mama and we can get your question to her. This recording will be available on YouTube, and I'm going to link to our podcast episode with Tiffany so we can hear it in its completion. And I guess I'll throw it to you, Tiffany. Any final words as we wrap up our live chat today?
No, I am so happy to be here. And again, our goal is just to help the schools do better and find those families that are a great fit for their program. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, thanks for your thoughts. I would wrap up with just, it's so nice to hear about how meaningful your work is. And I think when we talk about all of the different ways that you're impacting schools in the different stages, whether you're an early stage daycare or childcare center that's just opening or one that's been open for 30 plus years, everybody can do a refresh on our marketing materials, our communication platforms. What are we doing to work with parents in the mediums that they're comfortable with? So I want to thank you for your time today, and please stay in touch with us.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
All right, take care. Bye.
You too. Bye.